Context is king. Why real-world self-preservation training must match reality. I was recently working on defensive tactics with a friend who operates in the civilian close protection space. Her assignment came with a critical limitation. She wasn't allowed to carry a weapon due to legal constraints. That immediately changed how we needed to think about her approach to handling a threat. If someone tries to engage with your principal, I told her, you don't want to end up in a fistfight. That might seem counterintuitive for someone trained in combatives, but in this case, the goal isn't to win a fight, it's to keep the principal safe. That means redirecting the threat and getting the principal out of danger, not squaring up and trading punches. This conversation reminded me of a time I was asked to work with a special forces unit. Their mission parameters were brutally simple. If primary weapons are unavailable and hand-to-hand combat becomes necessary, we need to neutralize the threat in the fastest and most decisive way possible. There was no room for drawn-out exchanges or overly technical maneuvers. The objective was clear: end it immediately and move on. I built a program specifically for these mission parameters, which later became the Weaponize Your Body experience. The contrast between these two scenarios is stark. For my friend in her close protection assignment, the priority is evasion and escape, avoiding physical engagement whenever possible. In typical military operations on the battlefield, if it comes down to hand-to-hand combat, it's about sheer, overwhelming aggression. And yet, despite these clearly defined roles, I see countless self-defense programs teaching civilians techniques drawn from so-called military systems with little consideration for context. And that's where the problem begins. The illusion of battle-tested self-defense. In the world of civilian self-defense, there's an obsession with so-called military hand-to-hand systems, old and new. Marketing tactics rely heavily on buzzwords like battle-tested, combat-proven, or military-grade. But here's the irony. In real-world, life-and-death military operations, hand-to-hand combat is rarely used. Firearms, knives, and other primary weapons take precedence, because efficiency and effectiveness matter. Soldiers aren't relying on some secret martial arts system. They're using the most practical and expedient tools available. So why are civilians being sold these techniques as the ultimate answer to self-defense? Many civilians seeking out self-protection skills don't have real-world experience in interpersonal violence and naively believe that ripping someone's throat out or gouging their eyes seems like a realistic solution to the types of confrontations they are likely to encounter. It sounds efficient and immediate. Who doesn't want to be Jason Bourne, right? The problem is that many of these military-inspired methods don't translate well into civilian life. Soldiers typically operate under entirely different legal and ethical parameters. When we talk about the battlefield, they are trained for life-or-death combat, where their primary objective is to neutralize threats with maximum force. Civilians, on the other hand, must navigate legal systems that dictate what constitutes reasonable self-defense. In many places, even a well-placed strike could lead to criminal charges if deemed excessive. To illustrate this, let's look at a real-world example. In 2017, a Florida man named Michael Drejka was charged with manslaughter after he shot and killed an unarmed man named Marquise McLaughlin during a dispute over a handicapped parking spot. Drejka claimed self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, arguing that he feared for his life after McLaughlin shoved him to the ground. However, surveillance footage showed that McLaughlin was unarmed and backing away when Drejka fired the fatal shot. Prosecutors argued that Drejka's response was unreasonable and unjustified given the level of threat posed. A jury agreed, finding Drejka guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It's a tragic, real-world example of how a confrontation can escalate and how difficult it can be to make split-second judgments in high-stress situations. It underscores the importance of training, emphasizing situational awareness, de-escalation, and sound decision-making under pressure, not just physical techniques. Sadly, one only has to look at what is typically passed off as reality-based self-defense these days, and you will routinely see the instructor teaching responses to a shove or push that far outweigh the legitimate use of force. The reality is that most civilians don't need a military-style approach to keep themselves safe. They need a practical understanding of situational awareness, de-escalation, and contextually appropriate self-protection strategies. The ability to avoid violence altogether is often far more valuable than any physical technique. Sadly, this is hardly considered or even trained in most of these reality-based self-defense schools. Understanding context, what actually works in the real world. The bottom line is that self-preservation isn't simply about memorizing techniques. It's about knowing when and why to act. That's why understanding your environment, legal constraints, and specific threats is crucial. The truth is, many people overreact to even the most mundane slights in life. What we need in self-preservation training isn't more aggression. There's enough aggression to go around as it is. We need more equanimity and sound judgment. Take civilian close protection, for example. If you're working security for a high-profile client, the goal is always to remove them from danger as quickly as possible. A fight is a failure. It means you didn't see the problem coming early enough to prevent it. Physical engagement is the last resort, and when it happens, it should be nothing more than a tool to create space and facilitate escape. Most reality-based self-defense approaches are useless for this profession. Contrast that with special forces operators I have worked with, whose job may involve direct engagement with hostile forces. If a soldier finds themselves in hand-to-hand combat, it typically means something has gone terribly wrong, and the response must be immediate and brutal. The objective isn't to defend, it's to eliminate the threat before they can do the same to you. As a side note to this, I watched a documentary where a soldier, having lost his weapon entering a building, found himself face-to-face with an assailant. A physical battle ensued, with the soldier finally gaining the upper hand. Finding himself on top and in the mount, in his own words, he found it almost impossible to bring himself to thrust his thumbs through his opponent's eyes. And this was a person who, moments earlier, was trying to kill him. It is easy to say what you will do, but when you are actually there, confronted with the raw reality of interpersonal violent conflict, it is a completely different ballgame. This example underscores the point that even for military personnel who are said to be conditioned for combat, the reality of lethal hand-to-hand violence is intensely challenging on a human level. It's one thing to train techniques in a controlled setting, for example, offensive knife programs taught in reality-based self-defense. It's another thing altogether to execute them to finality in an actual life-or-death struggle. Then there's the everyday civilian living in an environment where interpersonal violence, while rare, remains a possibility. For most people, the chances of finding themselves in a life-or-death, hand-to-hand struggle are slim. The confrontations they're most likely to face arise from the frictions of daily life, disputes with strangers, altercations in bars or on the street, or crimes of opportunity like muggings. In these contexts, the primary goal should be to avoid or diffuse confrontation wherever possible. Situational awareness is key. Recognizing potential threats early, trusting your instincts, and removing yourself from risky situations before they escalate. Verbal de-escalation skills, including assertive communication and boundary setting, can be invaluable in preventing a physical encounter. Of course, there may be times when, despite all efforts to avoid it, violence becomes unavoidable. In these moments, the aim should be to neutralize the threat and create an opportunity to safely escape, not to prolong or dominate a fight. Simple, gross motor techniques that can be executed under stress are more viable than complex maneuvers that require fine control. Critically, any physical response must be proportional and legally defensible. Civilian self-defense is constrained by the bounds of reasonable force. What may be justifiable in a war zone or in the face of lethal threat has no place in an altercation with an unarmed, if aggressive, assailant. Understanding the legal framework around self-protection and the consequences of excessive force is as important as any physical skill. To illustrate this with a common scenario, imagine you're walking to your car late at night and notice a suspicious person loitering in the parking lot. A combative mindset may encourage you to preemptively confront the individual, ready to physically engage at the first sign of aggression. But a preservation mindset recognizes that engagement is itself a risk. The wiser choice is to keep your distance, deny the potential threat an opportunity to close in, and briskly make your way to safety, all while staying alert and ready to adapt if the situation changes. The problem with one-size-fits-all training. One of the biggest issues with the prevailing self-defense industry is the assumption that a single approach can work across all scenarios for all people. But training that doesn't take context into account is not just ineffective, it can be dangerous. A civilian who relies on military-style techniques might find themselves using excessive force in a situation that doesn't legally justify it. A close protection operator who engages in unnecessary physical conflict could compromise their client's safety. A soldier who tries to apply complex traditional martial arts techniques in close combat might not be operating with the speed and brutality necessary to survive. Good self-preservation training isn't simply about teaching fight techniques. It's about teaching people how to think under pressure. It's about preparing for the reality of the environment you're in, not the fantasy of what a fight should look like. This means incorporating critical thinking, problem-solving, and decision-making drills into training. Instead of just rehearsing physical moves, students should be presented with realistic scenarios and tasked with finding context-appropriate solutions. Instructors should challenge assumptions, introduce complications, and force students to adapt on the fly. In a self-preservation class, then, one should see variations of self-protection responses, not a one-size-fits-all. Bottom line, only by training the mind, not just the body, can we hope to prepare people for the chaos and unpredictability of real violent encounters. What real self-preservation training should look like. If you truly want to prepare for real-world threats, the first step is abandoning the myth that there's a universal formula for self-defense. The best training is tailored to the actual circumstances you're likely to face, who you are as a person, that is temperament, your ability, size, etc. With that said, one can, of course, apply an overall strategic outlook to dealing with a threat based on context while being adaptable enough to orient tactics based on moment-to-moment needs. For example, those in civilian close protection training should focus on de-escalation, redirection, and controlled physical intervention when absolutely necessary. The ability to move quickly, identify potential threats before they materialize, and create safe exit routes is far more valuable than knowing how to throw a knockout punch. CPOs working as a team should drill extensively on formations, covering and evacuating principles, effective communication with the rest of their team, and handling would-be aggressors without letting the situation escalate unnecessarily. For military personnel, hand-to-hand combat training should be streamlined, brutal, and entirely focused on neutralizing a threat as quickly as possible. It should recognize that primary weapons will always be the first choice, and that physical engagement is a worst-case scenario. Techniques should be gross motor compatible, designed to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. Training should inoculate soldiers to the shock and adrenaline of close combat through intense pressure testing, scenario work, environmental conditioning, and psychological training, such as what we offer in our Weaponize Your Body experience. For civilians, the focus should be on awareness, avoidance, and proportionate responses. A well-timed exit from a dangerous situation is always better than engaging in a fight. Learning to recognize when a situation is escalating, knowing how to create space, and understanding legal self-protection principles are all essential skills. Training should emphasize verbal boundaries, de-escalation tactics, and only the most high-percentage physical techniques. Scenario drills should focus on escaping to safety and never staying in harm's way a moment longer than necessary. Additionally, all self-preservation training, regardless of context, should address the psychological and physiological realities of violent confrontation. At the School of Crazy Monkey, we have a program, Inner Defense, specifically designed for this exact purpose. Adrenal stress conditioning, mental focus drills, and breath control exercises are invaluable for performing under pressure. Realistic training must expose students to the fear, chaos, and exhaustion of a fight, and teach them to function effectively in that state. Without a foundation of mental and emotional resiliency, physical techniques are unlikely to hold up when it counts. Train for reality, not fantasy. There's a reason so many self-defense programs fail their students. They're built on ideas that sound impressive, but don't hold up under real-world pressure. You have people who have created knife defense programs, but have never been in a knife fight or sustained interpersonal conflict for that matter. You have people teaching military-style combatives, yet have never been on a battleground. You have people teaching others how to defend themselves in a worst-case scenario, but they have never had to protect themselves in a life-and-death encounter. The self-defense industry is one of the few professional fields where it's possible to gain a reputation as an expert without significant first-hand experience in the skills being taught. In many cases, instructors are teaching techniques for life and death situations that they themselves have never had to apply under real-world conditions. This disconnect between theory and practice is a serious concern, as it can lead to the proliferation of unproven or ineffective methods. While it's true that you don't necessarily need direct experience to be an effective teacher, there's a risk of perpetuating techniques or mindsets that don't hold up under real-world pressure. Instructors who have never pressure tested their skills in live, unscripted confrontations may not fully grasp the challenges of applying techniques in the chaos and stress of an actual fight. Moreover, students place a great deal of trust in their instructors to guide them towards viable, reliable self-protection strategies. If an instructor's knowledge is purely theoretical, there's a danger of instilling a false sense of confidence that can fail catastrophically in a real encounter. Now, this isn't to say that all instructors must be battle-hardened veterans or survivors of violent crime, but there's a strong argument that to teach self-preservation responsibly, instructors should have some first-hand experience with real-world aggression, whether through sparring, scenario training, or professional exposure to violent confrontations, such as law enforcement, security, or emergency services work. At the very least, their curriculum should be pressure-tested and validated by those who have such experience. The bottom line is this: effective self-preservation training must be grounded in the realities of actual violence, not just in theory or controlled drills. Students betting their safety on their training deserve nothing less. As an industry, we need to be rigorously honest about what does and doesn't work under pressure, and prioritize practical, proven strategies over flashy or hypothetical techniques. Responsible instructors should be transparent about their experience and the limitations of their knowledge. They should continuously pressure test their curriculum, seek out first-hand accounts of real confrontations, and be willing to discard ideas that don't align with reality. Only by anchoring our training in the realities of actual violence can we hope to truly prepare students for the challenges they may face. If you want to invest in practical, real-world self-preservation skills, start by honestly assessing the scenarios you're most likely to face. Seek out training that emphasizes situational awareness, verbal de-escalation, and context-appropriate physical tactics. Don't settle for one-size-fits-all approaches or arts that make grandiose claims. If an instructor can't clearly explain how their methods align with your specific needs and circumstances, look elsewhere.